right, so we can start. Thanks to you all for being here. My name is Mario Cedrini. I'm from the Department of Economics and Statistics, Cognetti de Martiis, and I'm very glad to introduce this seminar today. It's a seminar about a book, about research, of course, and the book is Michael Heinrich, La scienza del valore, which has been translated into Italian, and it will be discussed today by the editors of the book and by a series of speakers. I simply wanted to, to say hello, of course, to all who will discuss today this book, and I will now leave the floor to Riccardo Bellofiore, who is the real organizer of this event from the University of Bergamo, and we thank him for organizing this initiative. I just want also to say that the initiative is also co-organized by the Italian Association for the History of Political Economy, STOREP, jointly with the Department of Economics and Statistics, Cognetti de Martiis. So we are here at the Campus Luigi Einaudi, and thanks to you all once again, and to the author of the book in premise. Riccardo.
Thanks a lot for the department here in Turin that invited us. Thanks to Mario Cedrini for helping organize, and Angela Ambrosino for organizing this. This book would have not existed without Stefano Breda, the other co-editor, who did a wonderful translation in Italian. I would even go as far to say that the translation is better than the original, but probably this would be too much. The few things that I want to say are to introduce Michael Heinrich, who is one of today the greatest names in Marxian scholarship, not only philology, but in all around way. He was born in Germany. He studied in the early 80s mathematics and physics. He did a dissertation on mathematical problems in field equations in the general theory of relativity in Berlin at the Freie Universität. Contemporaneously, he says that he preferred to study slowly. It took 10 years, but contemporaneously he studied in the Department of Political Science, that included sociology, economics, etc. Something much bigger than a similar thing here with the Laboratorio di, what's the name? Economia Politica, Cognetti de Martiis. He did a diploma there, published in '86, on the change of the notion of capital from the Grundrisse to capital, the book. But then he made the PhD dissertation with Elmar Alsvater that was published. The dissertation is in 1990. It was published the year after as Die Wissenschaft vom Wert, which is exactly the book that we are presenting, La scienza del valore. But in the first edition, we are actually presenting a second enlarged edition of 1999. He did some little updates all over the year, but that's the book. He is an author who has been translated in all the languages, or almost them. Before I say the other important books, non-translated in Italian, let me say that, again, thanks to Stefano and a little by me, I am very proud that this is the first worldwide translation of this Die Wissenschaft from Wert, which is the standard work, and not only because we two co-edited it. We are waiting in the future an English translation and a French translation. Before going into the other books, the last information is that he was teaching at the technical school, the Hochschule für Technik und Wirtschaft, techniques and economics. Sorry for butchering the German. But like me, he decided to make the so-called great resignation and to leave before, because simply we could do that. Among his main books, I give only the English title. There is an introduction to the 3 volumes of Capital, which in English is translated by the Monthly Review Press, but it has been translated in 12 languages. Then, again, the Monthly Review Monthly Review published a book, How to Read Capital, which is a reading and interpretation of the first 5 chapters of Capital. And then, most important, the biography. We hope that he will live forever, because at first they should be 4 volumes. The first volume was out in 2018, for some reason, probably because it was the 200th birthday of Marx, and is now going into a second edition. And this goes until 1841, Marx's dissertation. The second volume will be published hopefully in 2025, and it is from 1841 to 1845 January. In fact, it is the early Marx. You could think that there will be other 10 volumes. No, there are only 2 other volumes at present. The third from 1845 to 1857 before the Grundrisse. And then the fourth from the Grundrisse onwards until the death of not Marx but Engels. It has been translated in English, Portuguese, Castellano, French, Arabic, Chinese, Korean. I tried with some Italian publisher, no success, and it would be good to have it also in Italian. Now I propose that the first speaker is Luca Timponelli, and then Isabella Consolati. Luca Timponelli is originally a philosopher, studied economics in Turin, also with Roberto Marchionatti at the Fondazione Einaudi, and he has published an important book, L'automa e la veste da ballo, and I don't go into explaining what it is, but the title is good and the book too.
Thank you, Riccardo, for your introduction, and thank you everybody for being here, and also thank you, Michael Heinrich, for being here for discuss and present his book. Michael Heinrich, Die Wissenschaft von Wert, is without doubts one of the most important books published on Marx in the last decades. One cannot but admire not just the command on the whole of the Marxian production, including the text and draft finally made available by the new Mega 2 Historical Critical Edition, but also the willingness to address all the issues at stake in Marx's project of a critique of political economy. A meticulous analysis and analytical treatment of all the texts devoted to this theoretical enterprise, from the Grundrisse of 1857-58 to the latest manuscripts for the second and third volumes of Capital, follows the careful reconstruction of the development of Marx's thought, showing how his original essentialist account of an alienated human nature was progressively superseded by the analysis of a specific social form, the capitalist mode of production, and of how the specific form shapes both the individual behavior and his understanding of the social world. In all these respects, Heinrich's book, finally available also in Italian, sets the standard of how a book on Marx should be written. Heinrich's main thesis is that Marx operates a clear break with the epistemological presuppositions shared by classical political economy and by contemporary neoclassical economics alike. Despite the antagonistic theories of value and the different emphasis concerning production and consumption, these two approaches belong for him to the same theoretical field. That is, they not differ in the fundamental understanding of the nature of the object of their inquiry, which follows from four anthematized assumptions, that is, anthropologism, individualism, historicity, and empiricism. Concerning the first point, the theoretical framework of political economy sets out to investigate a form of rationality that is believed to be inherent in human nature and which characterized both producers of the classicals, who compare the toil and trouble, so to say, of the different physical efforts required for producing the different commodities, and the neoclassical consumers, who compare on their side the opportunity cost of their choices in order to maximize their satisfaction. Society, and we get to the second point, is consequently seen exclusively as a collection of individuals, each of whom is on its own the bearer of this natural form of economic rationality. Since this rationality can fully express itself only in a society mediated by commodity exchange, market society, and here we go to the third point, is interpreted as responding to the human essence and is therefore qualified as natural. Lastly, both the human essence and the social form which follows from it are perceived as self-evident. The mere observation of empirical facts is an adequate source of knowledge of the social world in its entirety. On the other side, the Marxian procedure is exactly the opposite. The behavior of economic agents does not depend on a natural disposition they are endowed with, but is shaped by a specific social structure, the capitalist mode of production, within which only social reproduction social reproduction is regulated by the exchange of equivalents. Individual behavior thus ceases to be the starting point of the explanation of social phenomena and must in turn be explained by investigating the social structure as a whole. Market society ceases to be an emanation of an unchanging human essence and becomes a particular form of organization, the existence of which depends on two presuppositions: the absence of a direct socialization of labor and the separation of workers from their means of production. This different understanding of the social world implies, lastly, the rejection of any empiricist epistemology. Investigation cannot begin with the observation of particular interests, desires, and practices, since these interests, desires, and practices can be explained only in light of a social objectivity that is not immediately perceptible, but must be conceptually grasped. This deep transformation of the theoretical field is for Heinrich evident in Marx's development of a monetary theory of value, which is far removed from the classical labor theory of value. According to the latter, value results from the individual effort necessary to the production of a particular commodity as reflected in the actual labor time spent in its production. The comparison between the working time of two individuals, for example, the hunter who caught a deer in 2 hours versus the one who caught a beaver in 4, is sufficient to determine the value of these two commodities, and so the relation of exchange, the ratio of exchange. Money, which is introduced to facilitate exchanges, is entirely superfluous to resource allocation, which is regulated on the basis of physical effort alone. Monetary magnitudes are therefore seen as a veil which covers real relations, from which the investigation can, and indeed must, make abstraction in order to fully grasp the social mechanism. Marx's picture is radically different. Indeed, the redistribution of social labor, that is, the regulation of social reproduction, cannot rely on the labor time individually spent by producers, because the individual perception of effort cannot work anymore as a criterion of homogeneity for the different concrete labors, which, on a merely physical basis, are constitutively incommensurable. Only exchange can assign to the different concrete labors their relative weights as share of the overall social labor. Abstract labor, which Marx identified as the substance of value, is therefore not to be seen as a physical magnitude given in terms of working hours, but rather as a socially constituted one, established independently from the trader's will through the continuous comparison of private labors in the market, where they acquire their social validation. Since commodities cannot be equalized in terms of working hours expended in their production, a universal equivalent is required to socially impose homogeneity between otherwise incommensurable concrete labors. Money, rather than a mere facilitating device for exchanging commodities, is therefore the necessary embodiment of the social substance of value. At the core of Marx's theory lies, on the one hand, the explanation of how independent producers can be socialized through market exchange, a process which cannot be explained on the basis of natural properties of commodities and labor alike, and, on the other hand, the exposition of why the social relations at the root of capitalist production are perceived by the individuals as natural properties of things. However, despite the ambition to subvert the theoretical field of political economy, according to Heinrich, Marx was unable to completely break away from its presuppositions. In addition to the critique of their object of inquiry, this was defined by the classicals, Marx conceived his enterprise also as a solution to the problems left unsolved by them, and was therefore led to reintroduce, often alongside his new reformulation of the issue, the same substantialist, empiricist, and individualistic outlook he was trying to overcome. In addition to the need to popularize his own findings, this explains why the first chapter of Capital presents elements that point to an unequivocally physiological interpretation of abstract labor. The contradiction tied to this interpretation exploded in the materials for the third book of Capital, where Marx proved unable to satisfactorily address the compatibility between a labor theory of value with the uniformity of the rate of profit among all the sectors in the economy, and vainly insist on demonstrating the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. Marx's inability to completely break with a premonetary theory of value also returns in his discussion of socialism in the critique of the Gotha program, where he conceives a post-capitalist society in which social labor is redistributed by keeping account of the working hours which are necessary for the different social tasks. The thesis that in Marx we witness the break with anthropologism, individualism, historicism, and empiricism that characterize a large part of contemporary economic thought is absolutely persuasive. I also agree on the need for a monetary theory of value which safeguards money an indispensable role in the a posteriori socialization proper to the capitalist mode of production. Another relevant point of Heinrich's interpretation, which I can only mention, is the acknowledgement of the heterogeneity between Marx and the neo-Ricardian project of rehabilitating an alternative approach to the neoclassical theory of value and distribution. This is true not only because money is derubricated in neo-Ricardian models to a mere function of numeraire, so as a unit of account, but also because, as Heinrich correctly observes, Marx's dynamic approach, in which technological progress is an endogenous component of capitalist accumulation, cannot be translated into the linear models of reproduction set out by the neo-Ricardians, which must make abstraction from any change in the condition of production. However, I think it is necessary to interpret the relationship between classical economists and Marx differently from Heinrich. This will lead to a different interpretation of abstract labor in Marx, which I think can be recognized in its physiological basis without that value lose its social dimension and without that money loses its necessity in the valuation of commodities. It will be then possible to return to the question of the relationship between value and average profit, of the tendential fall in the rate of profit, and on socialism, critically engaging with Heinrich's positions. Concerning the classical economists, I don't think that they always adhere to an individualistic and empiricist interpretation of the social structure and consequently of value. I think that value for them was primarily considered not in terms of individual sacrifice, but rather, first and foremost, as the expression of the whole disposable time of society, which must be redistributed by the means of prices among the different sectors of the economy. Already in Hobbes' Leviathan, labor is recognized as the sole determinant of value because it is the sole cost that society must spend to reproduce and expand itself. A point also reinstated by Riccardo in his chapter on value and riches. The issue at the stake is, on the one hand, for the classical, how to increase the share of social labor which can be devoted to the expansion of the economy and to the production of luxuries by reducing the time which society must devote to simple reproduction, and on the other hand, which are the constraints which must be faced as capital accumulation goes on. Pettis and Smith's examination of the division of labor, Smith's analysis of the variation of the relative prices between agriculture and manufactures, as well as Riccardo's analysis of diminishing return in agriculture, derive from this approach. If the individual labor time expended in production of an individual commodity were sufficient for the determination of the latter's value, the emphasis by these authors on the average social condition of production, which in my opinion aren't less social than Marx's socially necessary labor time, would remain unexplained. Value is always social because unequal labor times expended must be equalized in consequence of competition. And on the other hand, equal labor times must be differentiated because of their different intensity, according to which, of a different intensity, or of a different difficulty in producing qualified labor, that is, of a higher or lower quantity of social labor, which must be devoted to the formation of labors of different kinds. Although the classicals, believing that exchange was the natural institution for mediating social reproduction, did not recognize in value a particular and historical form of manifestation of social labor, their approach, oriented to the social structure as a whole, you can see, for example, the incipit of the Wealth of Nations, which begins with, I quote, the annual labor of every nation, end of the quote, and of the principle of political economy, which starts with the problem of the distribution of the whole produce of the earth, is irreducible for me to an empiricist position. The fact that the classicals failed to reconcile a theory of value based on the labor expended in production with the existence of other economic phenomena they observed, particularly with the uniformity of the rate of profit, does not mean that they could give it up, because it would have invalidated the whole of their research program on the causes and consequences of capital accumulation. If Marx's analysis of the value form undoubtedly breaks away with the high historicity and anthropology implicit in classical political economy, his approach to the value magnitude follows and develops the one already present, albeit not always in a coherent fashion, in the classical tradition. In each period, society spends a given quantity of abstract labor, that is, an amount of human energy, with two dimensions, time and intensity, for the satisfaction of a series of given requirements for its own reproduction. This quantity determines the amount of new value produced in each period, a portion of which is necessary for the workers in order to access to their means of subsistence, and another one is appropriated by capitalists. In each industry, workers perform heterogeneous sets of qualitatively different tasks, concrete labors, whose only common trait is that of being shares of the socially available labor time. Commodities are then brought to the market, where they receive a price which must satisfy two conditions. Competition, which in each industry requires that commodities of the same kind, but produced with different amount of socially necessary labor times, must receive the same price. Competition between industries requires that commodities produced with different proportion between variable and constant capital and different turnover times must secure, for a given rate of surplus value, a uniform rate of profit for the capital advanced in their production. These two conditions can be secured only through value transfers, in the first domain, from the less productive to the most productive firms, in the second domain, from the industries who are more labor-intensive and who have the highest turnover rate to those who are more capital-intensive and have the lowest turnover rate. Hence, there is no proportion for each single commodity between the labor expended in producing it and the share of social labor it is represented as its price. This latter can be manifested only through money as a universal equivalent, which here I think is no less necessary than in Heinrich's interpretation. This is all the truer if we take into account not only the value created ex novo, but also the value produced in previous periods, which also necessarily appears as a component of the price of commodities. At the beginning of each production process, means of production and labor power are both a given price, which are the result of previous process of surplus values extraction and distribution. Hence, we have a sequential process of analysis. First, the determination of the social surplus value starting from a given money prices of constant and variable capital, the length of the working day, and the monetary expression of labor time. Then, its
its repartition through competition. Differently from Heinrich's positions, according to which the exchange autonomously fixes the relative weights in terms of value of the products of different concrete labors, a process which remains, in my opinion, in the last analysis unexplained, here the process of price formation can be accounted for through the double-sided analysis of competition. This approach allows, as I think Mosley has shown, to discuss the formation of a uniform rate of profit without assuming a double system of values and prices, as in the traditional interpretation which remonts to Borkiewicz. Concerning the tendential fall in the rate of profit, Heinrich's mathematical analysis correctly demonstrates that it can take place only if, on the one hand, the working day cannot be prolonged indefinitely, and, on the other hand, the mass of constant capital can grow without limits. Since the growth of the constant capital in terms of value is not strictly necessarily linked to economic progress, which can also as well produce a fall in the value of the means of production, which is capable to outbalance the quantitative increase of machinery per worker, Heinrich argues that Marx cannot provide a demonstration that the rate of profit will necessarily fall in any possible case. He's right, but it seems to me that Marx did not want to provide a demonstration, but rather an explanation for a tendency which was held as taking place not only by Smith, Ricardo, and Marx himself, but also, among others, Jevons, Varras, and later Keynes. This is why he introduces the rising value composition of capital as an observable trend. Moreover, Heinrich acknowledges that, given an increasing mechanization of the economy, a stationary or falling value composition of capital can occur not only at the condition that labor productivity increases faster in the sector producing the means production than in the sector which produces the wage goods, but also, so all the two conditions must hold, but also if the former increases without also affecting the price of the latter, a state of things he rightly judges improbable. Less persuasive is the attribution to Marx of a theory of simultaneous cost-minimizing competition like the one adopted by Occhiscio for disproving the tendential fall in the rate of profit, according to which there is no reason for capitalists to introduce innovations which lowers the rate of profit. This interpretation, by quoting the interest of capitalists as a class and the advantages which particular capitals can gain, ignores the possibility for the innovative capitalists to increase their individual profits by pocketing the difference between the average and their individual costs, appropriating in this way the surplus value extracted by their competitors, even if the innovation has the effect of increasing the composition of capital and therefore to decrease the general rate of profit. In any case, the passage invoked by Heinrich in favor of this position, taken from the 13th chapter of Capital, simply states that capitalists have no interest in reducing labor expended in absolute terms, but only to the point it allows them to reduce the unitary cost. The failure in taking account the redistribution of surplus value in intra-industry competition explains why Heinrich interprets a passage that is a note to the 23rd chapter of the first volume of Capital, which describes the increase in the rate of profit for a competitive capital as a hint that for Marx competition should lead to a general increase in the rate of profit. By adopting an essentially modern, that is neoclassical and neo-Ricardian alike idea of competition, I think that Heinrich fails to acknowledge the specific limit of capitalist production in which the increase in material wealth is by no means absolute but limited by the condition of monetary profitability. Concerning socialism, I must limit myself to two very quick remarks. I think the discussion of the possibility for emancipation that the critique of political economy allows to highlight cannot be separated from the discussion of the transformation of the labor process covered in the chapters on cooperation, manufacture, and modern industry in the first book of Capital. According to Marx, it is particularly the last chapter, so the chapter on modern industry, that lays, at least as a possibility, the foundation for a truly cooperative production, a point on which the book remains silent. Secondly, if one accepts that value and therefore money are the specific devices for distributing social labor in a society which produces commodity, the direct accounting of social labor, if we accept, as I propose, it to be a quantifiable magnitude, is to be seen not as a vestigial of a pre-monetary theory, but rather as the expression of the necessity to overcome the value form in order to achieve a truly emancipated society. Thank you, everybody. And I leave the floor to Isabella Consolati.
the next speaker is Isabella Consolati. She is an historian of political thought, now teaching at the Polytechnic of Turin. She has a PhD in modern and contemporary history from the University of Pavia and the University of Innsbruck. She had a significant career before, and she's now interested in the history of scientific and political thought. Se non è acceso. History and political thought in the German area from the 18th to the 20th century, and a lot of themes of research about formation of geography as modern science, the relationship between space and history in political thought, Marxian theory of history and global space. And presently she is studying the relationship between politics and technology in the field of cybernetics and artificial intelligence. So we are on the frontier. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for the invitation and the organization of this event. I'm very pleased to have the chance to discuss this ponderous book with you and with Heinrich in particular. Before commenting on the book and posing a lot of questions to Heinrich, I have to say, to begin with, I would like, please allow me to make a short premise. Because I'm not an economist and I have been reading and studying the work of Karl Marx, not predominantly from the point of view of the critique of political economy as such, but in terms of his understandings of politics and history in a global scenario. So I started by inquiring the problem of colonialism in the works of Marx, focusing on the Indian case in particular and on the problem of state power in his articles for the New York Daily Tribune dedicated to the East India Company. Then I've been interested also in the problem of the relationship between formal and real subsumption on the level of the world market. And as part of the collective project that resulted in the book titled Global Marx, History and Critique of the Social Movements in the World Market, edited by Eleonora Cappuccilli, Matteo Battistini, and Maurizio Ricciardi, I have contributed with an essay on the readings by Marx of the French liberal historian, in particular Augustin Thierry and François Guizot, who Marx considers the inventors of the idea that history is class struggle. Throughout my studies, I have been constantly confronted, to borrow with the distinction made by the Armenian Marxist Harry Arutunian, with two levels of analysis that I think need to go together. One is the problem of the historical time of capitalism, its logistics, and the other one is the problem of the relationship between capital and history, capital and historical difference. So this premise on myself is just to say that while of course considering the major works like Grundrisse and Capital, I have been relying in my studies of Marx on a body of text that is not at the center of the book by Heinrich, Die Wissenschaft von Welt. Luca Timponelli has already summarized very clearly and well the main thesis of Heinrich, that basically in its core is the idea that Marxist theory represents a scientific revolution in the history of the social sciences, that Marx did not limit himself to elaborate a new theory, but rather contributed to create a new theoretical and scientific field. In other words, Heinrich says that he introduced a wholly new problematique, a wholly new structure of the question that he posed to the historical material, in comparison both to classical political economy, but also if one compares him to the later marginalist school. Heinrich is very clear in highlighting what are the pillars of political economy that Marx destroys, and as also Luca was recalling a while ago, anthropologism, individualism, ahistorism, and empiricism. And the whole book is dedicated to a detailed and deep analysis of this conceptual innovation, and also to the point in which Marx was not able to detach himself completely from the scientific terrains he otherwise criticized. So in front of this thesis, my observations will be made starting from my own path of studies and my attitude to consider a global Marx, also in the sense of not separating, let's say, the scientist from the historian of the present and from the man who was politically active in the construction of a political movement of the working class that, in order to assert itself, had to confront the power of capital, but also a wide set of historical conditions, internal divisions, individualization processes, raising nationalism, dynamics related to states, to wars, to nature itself. My impression was that in Heinrich's book, the two characters, let's say, that make up the historical Marx are radically separated. And while assuming from Louis Althusser the idea of an epistemological rupture that separates the anthropological approach of the young Marx from the later scientific works, Heinrich rejects Althusser's later self-critical claim that at the heart of this rupture there is a theoretical, practical class position that is a political stance rather than an epistemological one. By the way, in the book you can find an essay after the introduction by Riccardo Bellofiore on the relationship between Heinrich and Althusser, written by Vittorio Morfino, that is very useful. So to Althusser's self-critique, Heinrich replies that philosophy and science cannot be reduced to a battlefield, if not at the risk to vulgarize somehow Marx and undermine the objectivity of his science. So my first question to Heinrich is, what concept of science do you rely on? So you highlight, as said, that Marx innovates the scientific field and not simply adds a new theory to a row of economic theories. This seems overall very convincing. But it seems that in this innovation, the parameter of what is science and what is not, like objectivity, neutrality, demonstrability, also to some extent quantification, is in truth already presupposed. Isn't this a way to reinstate a sort of scientific transcendental that continues despite the radicality of the epistemological rupture that one can recognize at play in Marxist theory? And are we sure that all political understanding of science can be reduced to a sort of standpoint theory that relativizes all reference to objectivity? It always struck me in this relation Marx's definition in The Poverty of Philosophy of communism in its theoretical side as the science produced by the historical movement. Besides, in the inaugural speech of the International Working Men's Association, talking about the reduction to 10 hours of the working day, Marx says that after 30 years of struggle, for the first time, the political economy of the middle class lost in front of the political economy of the working class. So my question is, what kind of connection do you see between your concept of science and the working class? Is Marx's a science of the working class? And I think that this question somehow runs through the book from premises to conclusions. It has to do indeed with the conclusions on socialism, in which you spend time to criticize the readings that see a normative understanding at the basis of the relationship between capitalism and crisis. As you state towards the end of the book, and I quote, so sorry, I translated into English from the Italian, so it might be something wrong, but you say, I'm pretty sure that you say, there can be a scientific socialism, but not a socialist science. And you say that, you write that Marx and Engels wanted to lay the scientific foundations of socialism, starting from the evolutionary tendencies of the capitalist society. So what type of agency do you bestow in this evolution, whose laws, let's say, have been discovered by Marx and Engels, to the working class? And this is related to the question of, is Marxism a science of the working class?
Just repeat the last question.
Yeah. What type of agency do you recognize in this evolution you detect to the working class, basically? My second point has to do with the reference, let's say, to the factory legislation that I made before. So Heinrich exposes with an incredible precision and abundance of references, as also Luca was explaining, the monetary theory of value that Marx formulates, different from the political economist, even if in some points he falls back in a non-monetary theory of value. You linger very convincingly on the centrality of money as the new sovereign, let's say, and the representative of a societal synthesis, which is undeniable in Marx's analysis, and also defines the category of abstract labor because it is only through money in the exchange that different labors can be compared with one another. So you explain abstract labor is specifically social determination of labor, which only comes through exchange. If I'm not mistaken, this centrality of exchange is the reason why both the issue of production and that of reproduction receive a comparatively small attention throughout the book. I will go back to reproduction in my third point, but let me focus now briefly on the issue of production. So factories and the labor process are strikingly not very present in the book. This has the merit, in my view, to highlight the capacity of the capital relation to transform the overall societal organization. Exploitation of labor has not to do only with the relationship between masters and workers in the factory, and the factory is not the only place where the capital relation is active. But there is a problem, I think, that I would like to raise. So Marx says that the worker, in the act of exchange of his or her labor force as a commodity, follows his or her own interest and aims at valorizing the commodity that he or she is as much as he or she can. Here, the worker is ein Einzelne, an individual. But in the Grundrisse, Marx writes it clearly in a passage that you mentioned in a footnote: while the purchase of labor power works formally as an exchange of commodity, the appropriation of living labor in the labor process only very difficultly can be considered an exchange, even though it is the consequence of an exchange of equivalents. This is why, as Maurizio Ricciardi demonstrates in his book Il potere temporaneo, that is now being published in English, as well as The Provisional Power, Marx uses so often the semantic of slavery to describe this appropriation of living labor, even though he in turn distinguishes very clearly between slavery and free labor. Besides, it is in the sphere of production and confronting this appropriation, when capital is forced to enter contact with non-capital, that a collective dimension emerges, because the valorization process is also a labor process. The struggle that resulted in the factory acts and in the factory legislation is, according to Marx, the struggle between two collective subjects, collective capitalist and collective worker. In your book, the Einzelne, the individual, of the exchange is way more present as a subject than the Arbeiter class, the working class, that is mentioned comparatively fewer times. It is, of course, not the original individual of the classical political economy, but rather the individual who is individualized through the value form and through exchange. But my question is, how do you see the problem of the constitution of a collective subject that was an undeniable priority for Marx, who, without pause, returned to the problem of the organization of the working class as a political movement, for sure not simply within the workplaces or the factory, but in society at large. I had the impression that in some points of your argumentations, the wheel somehow seems to come full circle, and that you end up depicting the worker as a sort of homo economicus, a depoliticized individual following an exclusively economic rationality. For my last point, I want to go back to the issue of social reproduction. So you mentioned at some point a feminist critique of Marx that claims that he did not consider the unpaid reproductive labor of women in the houses as part of the determination of the value of the labor force. I'm not interested in the economic relation between the unpaid reproductive labor and the waged labor, but rather in the way in which you frame the subordination of women in the households that is evidently the precondition of this unpaid labor. So you contest to the feminist critique that it confuses historical conditions with the general possibility of exploitation. You say that the unpaid reproductive labor is just an historical condition, especially present in the third world, so in a backward society, let's say. And I quote, always with my translation, the fact that a great part of reproductive labor is still realized in the family is more a remnant of a pre-capitalistic past and characterized by a non-completely developed capitalism rather than being a general condition of exploitation. So if I'm not wrong, you claim that the capitalist tendency is to free women from housework and exploit them directly in the workplaces, while providing somehow for a public organization of reproduction. So capital development goes hand in hand with women's freedom, let's say, and this through an evolution that is somehow independent from their own struggles as a spontaneous development. So I have some problems here because it seems that this line of reasoning risks relegating patriarchy to the third world and to backward society and turn women's emancipation into a result of capitalistic development. Doesn't this suggest that there is somehow a development that follows some necessary stages? Isn't this explanation at odds with the continuous persistence of patriarchy on a global level and of sexed relationships of domination that have a consequence on the way in which labor is distributed, let's say, in all societies throughout the world? And then also, always in relation to these topics, you state that the employment of both husband and wife, let's say in a family, is more convenient to capital because it decreases the value of the singular labor force, given that now two wages and not just one pay for the reproductive costs of the household. So I don't want to linger on the technicalities in terms of the determination of the value of labor, but I would like to ask you how you relate with other readings of this problem, such as, for instance, the one by Immanuel Wallerstein, who maintains that it is surprising how, after 400 years of capitalism, the amount of labor that is completely proletarianized in the world economy is lower than the 50%. So the reliance on unpaid and non-completely marketized forms of labor is key to keep the value of the labor force low. And even when reproductive labor is partially monetized, as it is the case today with migrant care workers, for example, there is a whole discursive patriarchal device that interlaces sexism and racism to keep the value of migrant women's labor as low as possible. So this is just to say an example to say that capital repositions past forms of domination and that the issue of the reproductive labor of women cannot be faced only in terms of an economical calculus, but has to do with a set of political conditions of exploitation. There is some labor that costs less also on the market because it is deemed natural and less developed its triggering. So the measure of the wages is the result also of this political devaluation of labor and of the attempt to consider the work of some based on sex or race as less valuable, less disciplined, and less skilled as the one of the others. So we see this very clearly. Of course, this goes beyond Marx, let's say, in the metropolitan space with migrant labor. And no need to say that these divisions that have to do with patriarchy and racism have to do a great deal with the problem of how to understand and assess the collective working class, let's say, in general. I close with another remark that have to do with this set of problems of in relation to reproduction, and has to do with, in particular, with what you call the extra-economical conditions of capitalism. So you maintain in some parts of the book that once capital has asserted itself in its fully developed form, It needs nothing but the mute coercion of the economic relationships. You say, for example, this has to do, of course, with how one assesses the role of the state. You say that state violence is key to bring about the capital relation, but once the capital relation is fully instituted, it is enough for the state to assure that it goes on normally by assuring the property relations. I would be curious in this respect to know how, within this framework, you read the repressive and disciplining functions of the state. But apart from this, to go back again to the factory legislation on the normal labor day, you read this as the result of the capacity of the state to act in the stead of the collective capitalist, also against the immediate interest of the individual capitalist. This is for sure true, as Marx himself highlights. But last question, why do you, if it is like this, why do you think that in the end Marx considered it a victory for the working class as a political movement? I don't think that it is because the legislation forced capital to self-develop and intensify its subsumption of labor, eventually approximating its own final crisis, because I don't think that this somehow ascetic logic of sacrifice is present in Marx. I think that it was the case because he considers, because he understands the state as a battlefield and as the arena that the political movement of the working class cannot but occupy from without, so beyond its representative mechanisms. So I would like to know what you think about this and what, how do you see it? Why was it a victory, let's say a political victory for the working class? So I've done enough questions, I think. Thank you.
Thanks for you. Lots of interesting questions, but before we have Stefano Breda. Stefano Breda made the graduation in Venice.
Yes.
And then the PhD in Berlin with a huge dissertation. We wait, or at least I wait, an Italian translation. It's it's in German, but very important, on credit, and the long title I don't remember, but it's one of the most intriguing part of Marxian theory.
Would like to start my speech from my experience as a translator, because translating a book gives the translator the opportunity to reflect very closely on the way a book is written. And this is all the more important in the case of the decision from Werth, because Heinrich's writing style, his argumentative style, but also the content of his book are in strong harmony with each other. And if I have to find a single word to define what these three elements of Heinrich's book have in common, I would probably choose the word disenchantment. Because Heinrich writes in a sober, very dry manner that leaves no room for rhetoric or figurative language. His argumentation is characterized by an iron logic that leaves no room for polemic or evocativeness. And in this limpid style, Heinrich reconstructs the theoretical path that led Marx to the critique of political economy and its relationship to earlier economics. But far from placing Marx on a pedestal, Heinrich questions Marx himself, laying bare without discount the ambivalences and weaknesses of his critique of political economy. He does not limit himself to criticize single errors of Marx, but he questions the coherence of the foundations of his theory, without fear of destroying more or less established myths, as the prior speakers also highlighted. But disenchantment is not only a characteristic of Heinrich's way of looking at Marx, it's also a characteristic of the critique of political economy itself, as Heinrich reads it. Marx progressively constructs his own theoretical field to the extent that he increasingly destroys the granitic semblances of essentialism in philosophy and substantialism in economics, unveiling the social character of the objects of political economy. However, here I come to some criticisms. It seems to me that the same disenchantment and the same iron logic that lead Heinrich to fundamental achievements may prove to lead at the same time to certain limitations of his theoretical construction. The notion of theoretical field is perhaps the key notion of the entire book. It allows Heinrich to define with incredible and perhaps unprecedented precision what distinguished Marx's critique of political economy from any other approach to political economy. What Marx abandons is not just a set of theories or approaches, but the theoretical field that those theories presupposed, defined, as already reminded, by 4 factors: individualism, empiricism, anthropologism, and ahistoricism. By taking as the object of his investigation the social nexus that binds individuals within historically determined social relations, Marx simultaneously abandons all 4 factors. But I think, just like any powerful weapon, the precise definition of Marx's new theoretical field can imply a recoil. I think that the recoil here is what we could call a lack of dialecticity in a double sense. The first sense concerns Marx's mode of exposition. I am convinced that Heinrich's definition of the theoretical field of the critical political economy is absolutely correct, and I am also convinced that Heinrich is right in tracing several of Marx's important ambivalences to the fact that he had not completely overcome the theoretical field of his predecessors. But I have the impression that the sharp contraposition between alternative theoretical fields runs the risk of mistaking for Marx's ambivalences and contradictions also elements of complexity arising from his dialectical mode of exposition. Given Marx's mode of exposition, one cannot expect Marx to enter the new theoretical field from a certain moment onwards by abandoning everything that belongs to the old theoretical field. Marx must start from the representations and questions of political economy as they are given within their own theoretical field, and progressively re-signify the terms of the questions and the questions themselves. I suppose that the commodity money question can be read in these terms. It is true that not breaking away from the commodity money hypothesis is a mistake, but this does not necessarily mean that Marx did not have to start from that hypothesis in his exposition. However, the dialectical mode of exposition is not chosen by Marx arbitrarily. Rather, it derives from the object of investigation itself. And here we come to the second sense, in which Heinrich's precise and disenchanted analysis might lack dialecticity. Marx describes the capitalist mode of production as an enchanted world, where relations, by virtue of what they are, manifest themselves differently from what they are. And this is why Marx cannot rely on an empiricist method, as Heinrich says, and must adopt a dialectical mode of exposition. But this is also why he cannot just abandon the old theoretical field and simply begin to present capitalist relations as they can be conceived in the new theoretical field. Because the way in which classical economists and philosophers have represented bourgeois relations and even the theoretical field of their theories is a necessary manifestation of the bourgeois relations themselves. Marx uses, in these cases, the expression Erscheinungsform. Erscheinung is to be distinguished from shine, because while shine is merely subjective, has deceptive appearance of relations, Erscheinung is a way in which relations themselves, due to their objective characteristics, necessarily manifest themselves to subjects. Heinrich, however, does not seem to pay too much attention to the distinction between the two words, and perhaps this is not by accident. It is possible that the iron logic of his analysis leads him to lose sight of the weight of subjective factors in the constitution and reproduction of capitalist objectivity. But the fact that subjective factors, such as representations, expectations, decisions, cannot be taken as starting point to explain capitalist relations, but must be explained on the basis of the social objectivity they contribute to constitute, does not mean that subjective factors do not play any role. And the role played by such subjective factors and their practical repercussion gives rise to paradoxes. So the risk here, it seems to me, is to see ambivalences of Marx where there are paradoxes of the capitalist mode of production. This point can be illustrated referring to the monetary theory of value, one of the issues in which Heinrich has brought up about decisive progress, showing with extreme clarity the necessity of ex post validation. Within Marx's new theoretical field, economic categories are articulated in a dialectic between the social level and the individual level. Correspondingly, the commodity form arises from the fact that commodity producing labor is social labor because its products have a social use value, but it is provided as private labor so that its social character needs to come out ex post within the circulation on the market. If it were immediately social labor, it could not produce value, but only use value, because it would produce goods or services that can immediately fulfill their function as use values on a social level, without passing through the mediation of monetary exchange. But even in the reverse case, in which labor remained private labor without social validation, it could not produce value, because without confirmation of their social use value in the sale, exchange value would not be realized. In both cases, one of the two poles that make a labor product a commodity is missing. Value is then not something that arises from labor itself, as in Riccardo, but from privately provided social labor. And this is the core of Heinrich's monetary theory of value. And it is only conceivable within Marx's brand new theoretical field, because value is here neither something subjective, as in marginalist theories, nor something materially substantially objective, as in the classical theories. Value is rather a social objectivity, which is only conceivable within a theoretical field that takes as its starting point not the individuals themselves, nor society itself, but rather a historically specific mode of socialization of the individuals. So Heinrich concludes that what turns a product of labor into a commodity is its exchange against money. Prior to the actual exchange against money, we cannot know which share of the total socially necessary labor is represented by the private labor that produced the commodity. We cannot even know if a certain product of private labor is effectively an object of value. Now, the magnitude of value of a commodity is certainly co-determined by the conditions under which that kind of commodity is produced. but the ultimate actual magnitude of value can only be measured within the circulation process when it emerges to what extent the product of private labor is also product of social labor. But what about value objectuality? Here comes the real criticism. To those who accuse him of flattening capitalist relations on the circulation sphere, Heinrich replies that value is indeed produced in the production process, but only exists in circulation. But this would mean that prior to the exchange process, there cannot be value objectuality, so that before being sold, products of labor cannot be commodities. Now, I would like to point out that a monetary theory of value does not necessarily lead to such a conclusion. Because before entering the market, products of labor are produced for the market. Capitalists only produce them because they expect them to be marketable. They expect them to be not simply products of private labor, but products of privately provided social labor. Does this turn these products into commodities, or isn't just an individual subjective expectation, meaning that capitalists subjectively expect their products to be commodities, but objectively they are just products until they are effectively sold? I think it is not a mere individual subjective expectation. I think it is a social expectation. Workers too expect their products to be marketable. They know that if too many of their products remain unsold, they will probably lose their job, by which the balance between privately provided labor and socially necessary labor will be restored. They work just because they get paid for their labor, and they get paid for their labor just because someone will pay for their products. This means that at the heart of the production process there is money from the very beginning. And this is all the more clear if you consider the specifically capitalist mode of financing production, which is credit, including bank credit, but also stock market. Whatever form it takes, credit has to be rewarded. And in order that interests on the capital invested in the production process can be paid, this production process cannot be just production of use values, but it has to be production of value. At the end of the production process, there has to be a surplus value, a part of which will be used to pay the interests. And this means first that credit immediately impresses on the production process a specifically capitalist character, which means being commodity production, and second, that investors will allocate their interest-bearing capital, financing only those production processes that they expect to be value production processes, and will finance more those productions whose products are considered to be more likely all products of social labor. So if it were only an individual expectation of a single capitalist that the products of a certain production process are values, then this single capitalist would not have access to the means of financing necessary to carry out that production. So it is not an individual, but a social expectation. Certainly it is a subjective expectation, but it is because of the practical repercussions of this expectation that the production process takes the form of the money capital cycle. Money, which is what turns products into commodities, is already present at the beginning of the cycle. Money buys the means of production, money buys labor power, so as long as it is wage labor, labor is related to money from the very beginning, and so is its product. So since products have a socially expected monetary value, labor expended producing them is already not only concrete labor, but abstract labor, although not yet actually quantified. So in conclusion, the fact that in capitalist societies, a product of labor at the end of the production process manifests itself as shined as a commodity, although it has not yet gone through social validation in the circulation process, is not a mere subjective appearance, shine. It is a subjective social perception that corresponds to objective characteristics of labor process in capitalist societies. And it is this dialectical unity of subjectivity and objectivity, as well as this dialectical unity of production and circulation process, that are in danger of being lost in Heinrich's disenchanted perspective. However, as I hope I've made clear, this more dialectical approach is, I think, perfectly compatible with the core of Heinrich's monetary theory of value, and thus retains also its political bearings. Because for too long, a large part of Marxists have focused exclusively on the immediate production process, treating any phenomenon concerning commodity, money, or capital circulation as a superstructural phenomenon. The monetary theory of value allows us to conceive the domination of capitalist relations as something broader than just exploitation within the immediate labor process. And this is all the more important today, I think, when we are faced with the combination of an enduring systemic crisis of capitalist economies, resulting in a deep worsening of the living conditions for a broad strata of the population all over the world, and towards which the traditional weapons of labor movement appear blunt, and the climate crisis that jeopardizes the very conditions of reproduction of human life on Earth, and is ultimately driven by the contradiction between the unlimited growth brought about by the laws of capitalist competition and the limits of the physical world we live in. This scenario forces us to ask not only the question how we produce goods and services and how we exchange them, how we work, but to radically question what to produce and how much to produce. Questions that the impersonal domination of capitalist relations makes nearly impossible to ask. But to properly understand how this domination works, and above all, to conceive, if possible, a way out of it, it is necessary to confront the paradoxes of an enchanted world, in which social relations are constituted by the actions of the individuals, but the constituent actions of the individuals are determined by the social relations they constitute. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now Michael Heinrich will try to answer to the questions and critiques.
Thanks a lot for organizing this event, and thanks a lot for all these three interesting statements, questions, critiques. I could make the story very short by stressing the role of the author of a book. I think when a book once is published, the author has not a special role anymore. The author is one of the many interpreters of this book, but the author is not necessarily the most important interpreter. On the other way, this means for me as an author, I learn things about my book by hearing questions, critiques, comments. And this is not just a polite statement, it is reality that other persons, they see connections which are really in the text, but I, as an author, didn't see this connection. So in a book, there is always more than an author consciously put inside the book. with this statement, I could already finish and say, okay, let's discuss all together as all many interpreters. Nevertheless, I will take some advantage from the invitation and try to answer to some of the questions. I'm not able to answer all. First, the rather pragmatic reason, I just heard it. I also would need a little bit more time for preparation, but also for what I understand and can say, the time will not be enough. I will start with Luca. Thanks for the very clear abstract of my book. So I think everybody who hadn't read the book coming to this discussion has a sound base with Luca's summary. I want to answer to two objections you had. The first was that my critique, or what I interpret is the critique of Marx against the classics, is too strong. The classics are not always totally individualistic. They have also a consciousness of social affair, of society as a totality. You quoted from Smith's preface that he's interested in the annual labor of the society. This is true. And I would also say this marks an important difference to neoclassical economics. They are much more individualistic oriented than the classics. And this make, in some respect, the classics also more interesting when you come from Marx. Nevertheless, I would keep my position in so far that I admit that the classics also have questions related to the economy as a totality. But then when you look with which means they try to find an answer, then you are very quickly on a very individualistic field where, for example, Smith inserts his, in quotation marks, labor theory of value with individualistic considerations for what I want to give my product and what I want to receive from another person. This is a very individualistic consideration he's doing. Insofar, the non-individualistic questions of the classic are, or at least there is a tendency to answer these questions within an individualistic framework. And this is for me important for the when I write about Marx. I also admit this point would be differently if I had the claim to write a history of the classics. Then what I wrote about the classics, it is not enough to say, oh, this is a history of the classics. And I criticized also this attitude of many Marxists reading theories of surplus value and saying, this is the history of economic theory. This, I think, is nonsense. I said this very clearly, but I don't want to reproduce it, that when I talk about the relation Marx and classics, this is already the history. The second point, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, and the Occhio theorem. I don't know, maybe I misunderstood it, but I had the impression that you misrepresent a little bit Occhio. His thesis was not that the individual capitalist wouldn't do anything which leads the general rate of profit to fall. Occhio states the individual capitalist wouldn't do something what his individual rate of profit bring to fall. And exactly this is the theme of chapter 13, the second section, where Marx says, no, not every increase of productivity by an expensive machine is introduced in the capitalist production process when the additional cost for the machine is bigger than the costs the capitalist can save by having less workers employed. He will not introduce this machine. So it is on this level of individualist profit rate, and then Occhio did it on the level of production prices. I try to do it formally, mathematically, on the level of values. We can show then also the general rate of profit will not fall. But okay, it's a rather special question. I don't want to come to more details. Your third point, what I think is very important, socialism and your critique of my chapter on socialism. Here I admit that this chapter, I would say, is the weakest chapter in the whole book. It was not, the idea was not to give some rough ideas about socialism, communism, or even the way to this. It was just to do some conclusions. When we have not a substantialist theory of value, but a monetary theory of value, and when communism rests on abandoning not only capital, but also commodity and money, then we must understand what we abandon when it is a monetary theory of value. And so I did some rather limited conclusions, but I admit that the conclusions I draw, maybe they would be misleading. So this chapter is really not, it's the weakest chapter in the whole book. I hope I can improve this, not in reworking the book, but I'm working also on an article about Marx's conception of communism, and I hope I can make the things a little bit better here. So I have to run. Isabella had a number, and you already formulated as questions. So I cannot say like I could do by the others, oh, what I understand, maybe it's a question. You were very clear saying, this is a question you have to answer. I don't know if I can do it now with all. First, wait, I will not do it in the order you posted. I will start with women's emancipation. You read my very few remarks as if I would say women's emancipation is a necessary outcome of capitalist development. Here I must say this was not my intention to say this. I would even say if someone formulates this, I would criticize this as a complete exaggeration. What I tried to do was something else. There were in the 70s, especially in Germany, some feminist authors who tried to show the capitalist exploitation in the factory is only possible because there is before exploitation of the women in the household, via reproduction work. So as if when now reproduction work is changed, is diminished, then we would have less possibility to exploit in the factory. This position, I think, also is wrong. So we can have capitalist exploitation, even a bigger exploitation, when the reproduction work in some respect is socialized. It is not the individual family who has to take care for children's care, children's education, household, and so on. When you have places where is taken care for children, I think the German word Kindergarten is introduced in English. So with less labor power, you can do taking care for the children, for the household, and so on. And Marx, in one little footnote, already dealt with this point in chapter 13. So from this I concluded there are different possibilities in capitalism. When a certain capitalism, like for example in Northern Europe, in Scandinavia, has a lack of labor power, and for this lack of labor power in certain countries, it plays no role that worldwide we have only 50% of the workers in capitalist structures. When there is a lack of labor power in Norway or in Sweden, this 50% doesn't help. But then they have to socialize, or capital has to socialize the reproduction sphere in order to set free more labor power. This setting free, I wouldn't identify with emancipation of women. I wouldn't identify with even diminishing of discrimination of women, that women are paid for the same work with less wages. There is in every capitalist society, you have this gender gap in payment. So my only thing was that capitalism is not so intensively bound to this female reproduction labor. There is a lot of other things possible, and perhaps this was a speculation of my side. It is the line of history that when more and more capitalism is installed, then more labor power is needed, and such a socialization of reproduction work comes more and more. Your other questions regarded the character of science of Marx, and especially, before this is a good transition. You said in my presentation, the different sides of Marx, Marx the scientist, Marx the political activist, Marx the historian, is divided. And I admit you are right, it is divided. In this book, in my biographical account, I just wrote already in the introduction that I want to avoid this. Then for when we really want to understand the whole Marx, we have to integrate these different sides, and I have even to add some more sides. For example, Marx the journalist. It is not identical with Marx the scientist. It's also a special talking, special writing. But in this book, Science of Value, I was focused on Marx the scientist. I was focused on separate what is science for Marx, what is value theory for Marx. So I had already, you can say, some limited questions, which then led to limited answers. What I would say, what is also missing in this book, what I stress in the biography, that all writings of Marx, even the most theoretical, they happen in a certain political context. They are not only theoretical answers to theoretical questions, they at least try to be political answers to political questions. And this is also one field which I didn't include in this book. Maybe I can say it was needed for me to also to get some clarity about theoretical questions. I think 30 years ago, I wouldn't be able to do this. It's also from my own learning process, I have to do certain steps, and I cannot start with step number 10 instead of step number 1. Now to the political standpoint of the science of Marx, what he promotes. This political standpoint, I think this leads a science constructed around a political standpoint. It has a lot of weaknesses, a lot of dangers. What Marx explicitly points in this famous quote against Malthus in Theories of Surplus Value, where Marx accuses Malthus to accommodate science to external interests, meaning I have a certain interest, I want to promote a certain class, and so I change already more or less consciously the questions in order to produce a result which gives benefit to this class. And Marx is full of contempt for such behavior. And such a thing, you can do it a little bit more subtle than Malthus, but this is really a big danger. Where science becomes political for Marx, and I agree from my point of view, is that the use of science, the field that you say, okay, we have for example, to see the working conditions of the laborers, what Marx is doing in Capital in a very extensive way. It is not necessary for his theory of value, of the theory of surplus value, to have such an extensive consideration of the working conditions. This clearly has a political impact, but it must follow very strong scientific standards. So no compromise to scientific standards. Yeah, and then you had this already in the middle of your text, but your presentation, but also at the end, why Marx sees a victory of the political economy of the working class over the political economy of the middle class. I would say this is not really a scientific statement. This is a political statement. He's doing something in to bring a benefit to the working class. On the one hand, to show, yes, you can have victories. This is important. This is a moment of empowerment, of bringing to inspiring persons to action. So I would say this is on a quite different field than on the field of talking scientifically about what is political economy. So even already the notion political economy of the working class is a dubious notion for the political. It's a if you would have said it is a victory for the political fight of the working class, this, I would say, is a much more precise point. But I think there is also at least one point connected to the scientific political points in Capital, in the theoretical discussion. Marx praises here that the fight and the interests of the working class had achieved a victory. He doesn't speak of a moral victory. Now mankind could go one step further. No, he avoids such a moral evaluation of this victory, and this, I think, contributes. It's a discussion. It was not mentioned in the discussion here. What is the character of Marx's critique of capitalism? Is it a moral critique that exploitation is a violation of human rights or something, or is it a non-moral critique? I adhere to the later position that Marx is not having a moral critique. He makes fun of Proudhon, who argues in a moral way, and that he here celebrates this victory of the working class, abandoning any moral categories or moral considerations. This, I think, is the contribution to the scientific discussion. What is the character of critique? So, and now I have 10 minutes to Stefano. Here's Stefano. Let me see. The first critique you did, Erscheinungsform and Schein. I agree that this is an important difference. For example, in the English translation of Capital, in the most widespread Penguin translation, it is totally confused. That when Marx speaks of shine, to seem, it is translated as to appear. It's very very big problem. I suffered by this when my commentary to the first chapters were translated in English. Very often we had to correct the translation of Capital. So you are absolutely correct in emphasizing the importance. Where I doubt that you said Erscheinungsform is objective, an objective category, Schein, seeming, is a subjective category. No, I would say both are objective. It is what is meant with Schein is not an individual subjective error or misrepresentation. The shine, for example, that in wages, it seems that labor is paid while the labor force is paid. This is not at all subjective. This is an objective seem. Insofar, I have my doubts. Then in the next considerations, you come to subjective factors which I would ignore in my presentation, and this you relate to my ignorance or less attention to this difference Erscheinung, Schein. Subjective factors, yes, in some respect, they play a very minimal role in my book. However, I didn't have the claim to present everything. It is not a commentary to Capital. It is focused on value theory. It is focused on the special account of Marx, which I try to separate from other accounts. That we can find in Marx or in Capital much more than the points I stress in Science of Value. I totally agree with it. Subjective factors, I would say, we find especially when we look to a concrete historical development of capitalism, when we want to understand, let us say, the English capitalism in 19th century, how does it produce cycles, nevertheless managed to rule the world, in quotation marks, to rule this enormous empire. When we come to such concrete historical situations and want to understand them, then of course we have to take into account more and more subjective factors. However, these subjective factors are not completely free or voluntarily. They are inside a certain structural framework. It is like the famous quote from the beginning of 18th Brumaire, the humans make their own history, but they make them under certain preconditions they didn't choose. And this holds also for these subjective factors, no matter if we look on the side of capital or on the side of the working class or on the side of politicians. Yeah, and then what you stressed as a direct critique, value objectivity in production or only in exchange. My position is very clearly also in this last discussions I had with Fred Mosley last November at Historical Materialism Conference. I see value objectivity exists only in exchange. It falls not just from the heaven in exchange. There is a prehistory in production. Therefore, I stress already in my introduction to the 3 volumes, the question, where is value produced in production or in exchange, is already a wrong-posed question. But the existence is limited to exchange. Your counter-argument is that in production we have capitalist expectations. Until this point, we agree, I say yes. And now you stress these are not individual expectations, but social expectations. And on these social expectations rests, for example, the loan a bank gives to a capitalist. I totally agree. But nevertheless, it's an expectation, not an individual, absolutely correct, a social expectation. But it's an expectation, and I think we have to distinguish, or Marx did this, expectation from the reality of this expectation, value objectivity. The expectation can be disappointed. There is in many texts, you can read, yes, this is the problem of realization of value. Marx didn't speak of realization of value. He spoke of realization of price. The price is the expression of the expectation. The capitalist has an expectation, a social expectation, and this leads him to give a price to the commodity. And the expectation that the price is realized is the basis, for example, for a loan. But if the price is really realized or not, We only can learn at exchange, not at production. And it happens very often that the price is not realized, that the product not even becomes a commodity. It is not only sold for a lower price, it is not sold at all. And also the banks knew this, not every loan can be paid back. Insofar, I must say I have not really to criticize what you said about individual and social expectation. I criticize only your conclusion that when we have a social expectation, God, now I missed the words, a social expectation in production, that we can say, yes, but then there must also be a value objectivity. And that money plays a role in production from the beginning. The capitalist has to buy machine, raw materials, to pay wages, and so on, is also not a contradiction to this. The capitalist has to pay money, so he must expect to get at least this money back, but hopefully a little bit more. But this is not an argument to say, oh, but then there must be value objectivity already in production. Okay, now, yeah, no, I'm at the end. I think there was from Isabella one question with the state. Did I? Yeah, here only to use then these 2 minutes. You are right. My treatment of state in science of value is limited, and it can even be misleading. However, I already improved my treatment in Introduction to the 3 volumes of Capital. It is not strictly limited to the 3 volumes. I have also a chapter on state and world market. And there I think I treat the state more subtle than it is done in science of value. But for science of value, I agree. Besides the chapter on socialism, also the remarks, there is no chapter on state, but the remarks on state are weak points of science of value. And now I'm exactly in the time. Thank you a lot for the attention, for the presentations.